Throughout the history of Britain's railways, the highest profits garnered by the train operators of past and present has been the shipping of vital goods and freight across the nation, ranging from short trip workings for individual customers comprising single wagons, as was the case in the days of Speedlink, to block cargo trains of up to 30 vehicles, including containers, tankers, car carriers and more. However, among the regular goods that is shipped daily for use by consumers, another vital cargo in the realm of the UK's rail operators is the transfer of hazardous materials, the movement of what are classified as dangerous goods, including explosives, toxic gases, corrosive and inflammable materials, being done with the highest precautions implemented in order to ensure their safe delivery. Freights categorized as dangerous goods by the railway companies have been part of their roster of shipped cargo since the mid-1800s, as with the emergence of rail travel as a means of speeding up journey times over the archaic canal network, thousands of miles of branch lines and individual sidings were built to factories wishing to have a direct connection with their nearest mainline railway. The transfer of dangerous goods, though, was one the railways were reluctant to partake in due to the inherent dangers of carrying such items, but under the Rail and Canal Traffic Act of 1854, which was developed to ensure the railway companies didn't maintain a monopoly on the transfer of goods over the canals, the railways were obliged to carry any and all goods offered to them. The only exceptions were instances where the goods being proposed for transfer might damage the rolling stock, or where they were physically too large for the bridges, tunnels and passing traffic on the main line. With their obligation under the Common Carriers legislation, the railway companies did allow for the transfer of dangerous goods, but only on the condition that the customer themselves provide a specially designed wagon that was suited to the carriage of such materials. The main concern of the railway firms, aside from potential damage to the rail company's own rolling stock, was the possibility that a leak of certain materials, most notably corrosive acids, might contaminate other goods within the wagon. In most cases, dangerous goods consists were comprised of the wagons hauling the hazardous material, in combination with barrier vehicles or reach wagons, this stock taking the form of largely redundant or obsolete vehicles that range from surplus freight vans to withdrawn passenger carriages that had been stripped of their interiors. The goal of the barrier vehicle was to either separate the hazardous goods from other cargo if the consist was a mixed freight with non-hazardous materials, or, in an exclusively hazardous consist, to provide a division between the dangerous goods wagons and either the locomotive or the brake van so as to protect the crew. In the case of oil trains, it was common during the years following nationalisation in 1948 for a redundant wooden-bodied mineral wagon, usually dating back to the Victorian era or the early 1900s, to be sandwiched into a rake of tankers between the locomotive and/or brake van. Come the late 1970s, though, and with an increased awareness of the dangers in hauling hazardous goods, dedicated barrier vehicles were developed which were designed to contain any spillage of corrosive materials, or to deflect against explosive goods if they happened to detonate. For chemical plants and oil refineries, regular locomotives were not allowed to cross the threshold of the facility and enter the sidings in order to position tankers due to the danger of fire, and thus the reach wagon was introduced, where a longer wheelbase redundant wagon, usually a flatbed, was positioned within the consist to provide the additional length necessary to meet this requirement. Other methods of avoiding the use of engines within hazardous yard complexes, especially in the days of steam traction, was the involvement of fireless locomotives, wherein the reciprocating engines were powered by a pre-filled reservoir of compressed air or steam that drove the locomotive for a certain period before having to be refilled, as per the Andrew Barclay and Sons fireless 040 tank engine of 1935, which was used by the Boots Company at their Beeston plant near Nottingham. Among the more dangerous cargoes to be transferred by train throughout the years, though, was the shipment of gunpowder and explosives for the British Armed Forces, and ever since they were first carried by rail operators, conveyance of these materials has been done using closed metal-bodied vans that protect both against the possibility of accidental detonation, but also prevent theft from sidings and goods yards. The general rule for transferring gunpowder vans was that, during peacetime, a maximum of 5 gunpowder vans could be included in a single train, while during wartime, entire trains of up to 60 vehicles could comprise solely of gunpowder vans, although there was a general prohibition on shunting gunpowder vans into goods sheds due to the risk of sparks, and therefore all unloading and loading of these vans had to be done in the remote corners of the yard complex. While the transportation of gunpowder was an operation that had gone largely without incident, One notable event took place during World War II on the night of June 2nd, 1944, when the lead wagon of a 51-car ammunition train, led by Austerity 280 number 7337, en route from Whitmore to Ipswich, caught fire as it approached Soham Station for unexplained reasons. With each wagon containing approximately 44 general-purpose 500-pound bombs, a massive explosion equivalent to that of the RAF Fold blast seemed imminent, but rather than abandoning the train and running for safety, the engine driver, 41-year-old Benjamin Gimbert, and his 22-year-old fireman, James Nighthall, chose instead to gallantly separate the burning wagon from the rest of the train and draw it away from the consist. Passing through Soham Station, approximately 140 yards away from the rest of the train, the ammunition detonated as it was alongside the station platform, causing a large explosion that killed Nighthall, as well as Soham signalman Frank Bridges, who was stood on the opposite platform watching the burning train pull through, though Gimbert was able to escape with severe injuries. The explosion also caused extensive damage to the station and surrounding buildings. Though this was but a fraction of its potential magnitude, had the entire train been allowed to detonate inside the centre of Soham, and despite the severity of the blast, emergency repairs meant that the line was open to freight traffic within 18 hours, and passenger traffic resumed the next day. For their efforts, both Gimbert and Nighthall were awarded the George Cross, the highest award bestowed by the British government for non-operational gallantry, while the heavily damaged locomotive was repaired and returned to work, continuing in service until it was scrapped in 1967. For corrosive chemicals such as sulfuric acid, nitric acid, hydrochloric acid, citric acid, and acetic acid, the applications of which include fertilizers, dyes, glues, gelatins, and explosives, these were transported in specialist wagons commissioned by the customers themselves, as the rail operators refused to convey such materials with their own rolling stock. However, by contrast, due to the unlikeliness of such freight exploding or giving off toxic fumes, acids and corrosive liquids would normally travel as part of a mixed service freight with other non-hazardous materials. For compressed gases, these were carried with no special precautions or rolling stock, as beyond the earliest records from 1860, the transfer of these forms of cargo was undertaken using iron or steel cylinders, meaning there was no need to undertake exemplary measures to safely convey this goods, which again could be slotted into the rake of a normal mixed-traffic freight train. Coal gas, meanwhile, was another dangerous goods the railway conveyed, although this was less for private customers or government agencies, as much as the railway companies themselves, who used coal gas to recharge the gas cylinders on coaches for lighting, and, in the kitchen cars, for feeding cooking equipment such as gas-fired stoves and ovens. The shipment of the coal gas was undertaken using a specialist series of tanker trucks that were slotted into mixed-traffic freight trains, while during the Victorian era and early 20th century, the supply of flammable gas to homes and industries for use in boilers and stoves was done through the creation of coal gas from a gasworks. The byproducts of the gas-making process included coke, coal tar, ammonia and sulfur, ammonia being left behind as the coal gas was bubbled through a sealed tank containing water known as the scrubber, while compressed gas ammonia, known as anhydrous ammonia or NH3, was produced through the thermal cracking process of oil refining. In both cases, leftover ammonia was dissolved in water to create compressed ammoniacal liquor, before being shipped for use by the fertilizer industry, but also for integration into explosives such as ammonium picrate, better known as dunite or explosive D, which was used extensively by the United States Navy during World War I. The transfer of surplus ammonia would therefore be done through specialist-built tank wagons, either owned by the customers themselves or by a hiring firm, though as time progressed, the discovery of natural gas reserves under the North Sea saw traditional coal gas replaced by liquid natural gas, or LNG, which comprises 80% methane, 10% ethane, and 10% butane, propane, and nitrogen. The transfer of LNG by train was only ever undertaken briefly in the years prior to the development of the British gas pipeline network, with the LNG tanks being specially built to handle temperatures as low as -160°C, and being designed to withstand incredibly high pressures as the liquid gas contents began to warm up throughout the course of the journey, LNG being conveyed as part of a dedicated block train. For liquid oxygen, the Brins Oxygen Company Limited, or BOC, had an arrangement with British Steel to supply tankers of oxygen to the steelworks when the on-site oxygen-making apparatus was under repair or maintenance, the tank wagons used for this substance being specialist-built 100-ton bogie wagons, which were separated from the locomotive by barrier vehicles, as compressed or liquid oxygen is classified as an explosive. For liquid chlorine, used in commercial environments such as leisure centres, these were, like corrosive chemicals, transferred in specialist tank wagons that had been commissioned by the customers themselves, and due to the lethal nature of this gas, barrier vehicles were included in the consist between the tank and the locomotive or brake van. From the 1950s onwards, liquid petroleum gas, or LPG, became a sudden bulk traffic on the railways as the application for oil-based fuels increased throughout the decade, mainly due to the rapid expansion of car ownership and air travel, though LPG, as the most common of the dangerous goods to be transported on Britain's railways, has seen several notable accidents throughout the course of its conveyance by train. One example is the Eccles rail crash of December 4, 1984, when a Transpennine Express service, led by a Class 45 diesel, ran into the back of a fuel tanker train east of Eccles Station in western Manchester, after failing to stop for a red signal, killing the driver and 2 passengers, while a subsequent post-crash fire burned throughout the day, although fire services were able to bring it under control. Only 16 days later, this time to the east of Manchester at Summit Tunnel on the Lancashire-West Yorkshire border, a Class 47 hauling a loaded oil train from Haverton Hill to Glazebrook derailed due to a faulty axle bearing in the 4th wagon while passing through the tunnel, igniting a blaze that quickly spread throughout the train. Jets of fire roared up through the ventilation shafts in 148-foot columns above the Lancashire hillside, propelling pieces of the tunnel and the remnants of the tankers skyward at speeds of 110 miles an hour, which rained down across the countryside in a manner similar to lava bombs during a volcanic eruption. With fire crews unable to reach the inferno inside the tunnel, their only option was to smother the blaze by forcing high-expansion foam into the portals, cutting off the supply of oxygen. But although the magnitude of the fire was reduced, it continued to burn for another 2 days before finally being extinguished. In the aftermath of the blaze, it was revealed that such temperatures had been achieved to melt the tracks and tankers down to an unrecognizable sludge, while the stonework of the tunnel walls had become so hot that they vitrified and ran like molten glass, although the sturdy nature of the tunnel meant that the overall damage to its interior was minimal, and the line was reopened in August 1985 once the trackwork had been relaid. Beyond the previous cargoes, 2 exceptions in the working manual for rail staff were given a special entry for their highly lethal nature, that being tetrathylled and hydrocyanic acid or HCN, tetrathylled being an anti-knock petrol additive for use in jet fuel. HCN, on the other hand, or correctly termed as hydrogen cyanide, is used in producing adiponitrile for nylon, methyl methacrylate, sodium cyanide, cyanuric chloride, gelating agents, and miscellaneous other uses, including in the manufacture of rodenticides for fumigating enclosed spaces, ferrocyanides, acrylates, lactic acid, pharmaceuticals, and specialty chemicals. Tetrathylled, in terms of its toxicity, is described in the manual as extremely poisonous, a lethal dose consisting of around 12 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, with poisoning occurring if inhaled or absorbed through the skin. HCN, meanwhile, has the potential to explode when exposed to flames or contact with oxidizers and alkaline materials, the gas forming an explosive mixture with air that will react with water, steam, acid, or acid fumes to produce highly toxic fumes of cyanides, and is fatal for anyone who either inhales, ingests, or comes into physical contact, as it can be absorbed through the skin. For tetrathylled, transportation by rail was done with the highest precautionary measures implemented, with specialist puncture-proof tankers being employed, although this goods was transferred as part of a mixed traffic freight, but under the condition that, during marshalling at yards, they were not to be shunted in proximity to wagons conveying steel in order to avoid the dangers of a barrel being punctured by a shifted load. HCN, by contrast, was transported using privately owned TUA 4-wheeled tanker wagons owned by Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI, of Grangemouth, and dissolved in ethanol during shipping. In light of the stated dangerous goods, most of these are now historic, as by the end of the 1970s, the policy for transporting hazardous materials was revised by the Health and Safety Executive in order to avoid the potential for accidents during traffic, and by the mid-1980s, the preference of the executive was for companies to only store small amounts of dangerous chemicals on their premises. These facilities would subsequently favour frequent movements of smaller quantities, and thereby encourage the transfer of these materials by road rather than rail, although the tightly regulated rail system presented a far safer means of transporting this deadly goods, rather than the comparatively more dangerous road network. For operations through the Channel Tunnel, while it is common for dangerous goods to be transported by train in mainland Europe, Eurotunnel regulations specifically forbid the transfer of dangerous chemicals, as well as explosives and LPG freight, between England and France via the tunnel, and therefore it has proven to be far more economic to undertake international shipments of hazardous substances by lorry and tanker truck, using the conventional car ferry from Dover to Calais and Dunkirk. By the time the Channel Tunnel opened in 1994, though, most dangerous goods traffic in the UK had disappeared, as the nation moved from a manufacturing-based economy to a service one, thereby seeing a widespread reduction in the need for dangerous goods and chemicals to be transferred by trains to supply factories and other industries. One example was the mass closure of British steelworks during the 1980s that wiped out the demand for bulk liquid oxygen, while those companies that continued to create and use dangerous goods preferred instead the transportation of these materials by fleets of lorries rather than utilizing privately owned wagons. Today, dangerous goods are still transferred by train within the UK, the most famous of which is the shipment of spent nuclear fuel from nuclear power stations to the Sellafield reprocessing facility in Cumbria on behalf of what was formerly British Nuclear Fuels, the transportation of this material beginning during the 1960s using specially built flask wagons weighing up to 50 tons, and were capable of carrying 2.5 tons of spent nuclear fuel. The Magnox flasks comprise 4 layers: an internal skip containing the waste, guides and protectors surrounding the skip, a 15-inch thick steel flask body, and a transport cabin of panels which provide external housing. The rigidity of these armour-clad containers was put to the test famously on July 17, 1984, when a withdrawn Class 46 locomotive and 3 coaches were rammed at 100 miles an hour into a nuclear flask filled with water during a crash experiment at the Old Dalby test track, the flask having survived the devastating collision with no leakage reported. With the privatisation of the railways in 1994, the transfer of nuclear flasks, which had previously been undertaken by British Rail, was brought in-house by British Nuclear Fuels, who established a wholly owned subsidiary called Direct Rail Services, or DRS, which, though initially basing its work solely on the transfer of nuclear flasks, has expanded to become one of the largest rail freight operators in the UK. Other dangerous goods still transferred by rail is the ever-present shipping of LPGs from the 6 remaining refineries in the UK, perhaps the most prominent example being the BP Grangemouth refinery on the shores of the Firth of Forth on Scotland's east coast, where imported oil is refined and then shipped by rail to various destinations. Furthermore, until 2006, Albion Inorganic Chemicals, now Brenntag, transported by tanker train inorganic liquids, solids, solvents and specialty chemicals from their plant in Sandbach, Cheshire, until the factory was closed and demolished. Another more infrequent dangerous goods is the provision of weapons trains on behalf of the Ministry of Defence, or MOD, these shipments usually employing a locomotive hauling Habbins-covered wagons filled with either explosives or small arms. Security for these trains is usually provided through the addition of a redundant passenger coach, in which guards provided by the armed forces will accompany the shipment throughout its journey, one of the more notable movements being to the Longtown Munitions Depot in Cumbria, north of Carlisle, which even sported its own 7-mile internal railway system, though the service has been reduced from once daily trips to twice a year. Into the foreseeable future, with a continued move away from manufacturing and a drive to reduce oil-based functions such as fossil-fueled powered cars and polymer-based products, the decrease in dangerous goods on the railways is set to continue, with only the transfer of nuclear flasks likely to be a consistent flow of hazardous materials by train beyond the end of the next decade. Nevertheless, the transportation of lethal cargo by train is another quirk of British railway history, and the fact that there were very few accidents during the height of dangerous goods transfer is a testament to the professionalism and precautionary measures taken to ensure the safety of both workers and civilians, as these extremely harmful substances came within close proximity to people's homes and businesses.